The following record begins with aggregated picked feeds, sensor logs, and eyewitness transcripts recovered from archival caches and independent remembrances. Static-laden comms recorded by salvage teams describe ash-choked horizons, radar returns obscured by suspended particulate, and fragments of voxel imagery that register only as jagged silhouettes against a ruined sky. Field archaeologists note that many of the recovered data nodes originated from auxiliary craft and ground units that were not subsequently logged in Imperial registries. Their provenance is marked only by crude stamps and partial fleet signatures. These accounts concur that an engineered battlefield was prepared and that survivors thereafter described the operation as both deliberate in design and catastrophic in effect. Reports assembled from Loyalist survivors and later investigative compendia established that the dropsite operation on Isstvan V occurred in the year 6 of the 31st millennium and stands as one of the decisive early turning points of the Civil War, known subsequently as the Horus Heresy. The event is repeatedly identified in records as a massacre in which ostensibly loyal reinforcements were committed to a planet already compromised, only to be struck by coordinated betrayal from within the larger force array. Over the decades, chroniclers have emphasized two concurrent facts. First, that the operation's immediate objectives were both military and political, purge remaining Loyalist resistance and demonstrate consolidated control, and second, that the scale and methodology of the action left 3 Space Marine legions fundamentally shattered and multiple Primarch-level figures deeply affected or lost. Contemporary tactical broadcasts and later reconstructions indicate that the War Master's initial tactical framing promised a clearing of residual Loyalist pockets after earlier contested engagements in the Isstvan system. The plan, as transmitted to participating commanders, required successive reinforcement waves to hold ground and complete mopping operations. Those who compiled after-action summaries judged the arrangement plausible as a conventional operation. Its catastrophic results only make sense when examined alongside clandestine orders and the later exposed affiliations of several ostensibly loyal legions. The operation therefore exists in records both as a field engagement and as a case study in how command architecture and sealed orders can be weaponized to conceal treachery. Recovered logistics manifests and ship-to-planet dispatch lists show that initial waves of deployees were dominated by contingents from the Emperor's hands, identified in surviving manifests as the Iron Hands, Salamanders and Raven Guard, supported by planet-side Loyalist elements and militia. These forces were organized for frontal assault into the Urgal Depression, a broad canyon region whose topography favored interdiction and enfilade fire from pre-established emplacements. Later arriving transports carried reinforcements that, according to intercepted communications, were expected to consolidate the gains of the initial deployments. What the field reports do not convey immediately, and what later archival review makes plain, is that those reinforcement waves contained elements whose loyalties had been subverted. The presence of these duplicative loyalties turned the operational architecture into a stratagem, a baited field into which loyal troops were drawn and then engaged by the forces they believed to be their allies. Material analysis conducted on salvaged artillery casings and power cell fragments demonstrates a pattern in the weapon, signatures recovered from multiple engagement loci. Ballistic coatings and plating microabrasions suggest the coordinated use of siege-level ordnance and anti-armor barrages timed to coincide with the arrival of specific transport waves. Sensor overlays from differing vantage points, later matched and synchronized by independent analysts, reveal that the War Master's forces employed sustained bombardment to channel movement and to deny egress once the trap was sprung. Where contemporaneous field journals record confusion and rupture in command transmissions, the forensic record indicates that several ostensibly secondary units severed channels deliberately, isolating pockets of loyal resistance and preventing effective consolidation. These material traces, when combined with survivor testimony, create a consistent picture of calculated encirclement executed with both heavy ordnance and procedural betrayal rather than a simple battlefield route. Eyewitness narratives, often fragmentary and emotionally compromised, nonetheless converge on certain discrete incidents that became emblematic of the broader event. One repeated account details a defensive bastion erected by Salamanders' troops in the lee of volcanic spires that briefly held against concentrated bombardment and mechanized assault before being overrun by a combination of artillery reckoning and assaults from units previously identified as allied. Another survivor account, corroborated by later pilot logs, places Vulkan, Primarch of the Salamanders, at the forefront of a desperate counteraction in which his presence and martial ferocity are recorded as the last visible action observed by salvage crews before the area was saturated by orbital fire and subsequent detonation. The compiled testimony established early on that losses among the Loyalists were not only measured in numbers but in the irreplaceable attrition of veteran leadership and unrepeatable doctrinal experience. Catalogues of the engagement list participating legions and note the critical turning point. Several legions that had been expected to maintain loyalty to the Emperor were, in fact, complicit in the War Master's plot. Records and later narrative syntheses identify 4 legions, names that appear across multiple independent sources, as having acted in concert with the traitor command. The immediate consequence of that realignment was the rapid collapse of the frontline cohesion that Loyalist planners had assumed would withstand a protracted engagement. Analysts who later examined the command-level transcripts argue that the betrayal was not haphazard. Rather, it was staged to appear as a legitimate engagement with the Loyalist reinforcements, thereby minimizing early suspicion and maximizing the shock inflicted on reserves once the killing field had been sealed. The demographic and material toll recorded in contemporaneous casualty lists and later memorial counts demonstrates scale. Several thousand veteran Space Marines from the Iron Hands, Salamanders and Raven Guard perished in the initial phases. These losses included not only rank-and-file contingents, but also senior captains and veteran cadres whose experiential knowledge comprised tactical doctrine and regimented combat culture. The catalogued deaths extended beyond Astartes. Planetary militias, auxiliary infantry, and numerous support cadres were annihilated or rendered non-operational. The numerical disparity recorded in different contemporaneous sources has led later historians to caution that exact figures vary. Yet the consensus remains that the Loyalist force suffered catastrophic reduction, sufficient to mark the engagement as a pivotal destruction of organised resistance in that sector. Beyond immediate casualties, the long-term logistical implications are repeatedly articulated in administrative correspondence recovered from later inquiries. Fleet allocations and doctrinal reserves intended to stabilise the region were diverted or consumed in the aftermath, leaving adjacent systems exposed and contributing to subsequent trajectories in the wider civil war. The loss of 3 legions' effective combat power and the defection of 4 others altered strategic calculations across multiple sectors. Commanders who inherited operational responsibilities after the engagement referenced Isstvan V as a watershed, noting not merely the attrition of material but the fracturing of trust networks that military hierarchies depend upon. The archive of post-action assessments therefore treats Isstvan V not only as a tactical catastrophe, but as a turning point that reconfigured loyalties and strategic expectations in the years that followed. Forensic interrogation of surviving command directives, later unsealed and analysed by mixed tribunals and independent remembrances, offers limited clarity on motive and on the mechanics of coordination among the betraying contingents. Those documents underscore that the assault's external framing, presenting the operation as a necessary purge of remaining Loyalists, provided political cover while operationally enabling the activation of prearranged interdiction sequences. Subsequent investigations also highlight the degree to which information control, sealed orders, and manipulated tactical communications were employed as tools of warfare. The operation therefore occupies a recurrent place in later military doctrinal studies as a case where deceit and administrative manipulation achieved operational objectives as effectively as maneuver and firepower. The battlefields of Isstvan V presented a convergence of distinct legions, each carrying its own heritage, operational doctrine, and unspoken expectations of loyalty. The participants numbered among the most disciplined and historically decorated formations of the Great Crusade. Yet within this convergence, concealed motives and divergent allegiances intertwined to produce one of the most catastrophic engagements of the age. The planet itself was an anvil of blackened basalt and volcanic ash plains. The Urgal Depression, where the main conflict would erupt, stretched as a scar cut deep into the world's crust. Ash dunes and glassy ridges offered poor cover, while scattered ridgelines served as natural choke points that would later amplify the slaughter to come. The Loyalist coalition committed to the surface assault consisted primarily of 3 legions: the Iron Hands under the direct command of their Primarch, Ferrus Manus, the Salamanders led by Vulkan, and the Raven Guard commanded by Corvus Corax. Each arrived with the belief that they were the vanguard of a final purgation against traitor remnants that had entrenched themselves on the world following the War Master's prior compliance actions. The narrative distributed to these commanders claimed that the traitor legions, those who had openly sided with Horus at Isstvan III, had withdrawn to Isstvan V to consolidate resistance. In truth, the War Master himself had arranged this narrative to draw out those still loyal to the Emperor. The Iron Hands were perhaps the most immediately distinct among the Loyalists. Ferrus Manus had forged his legion into an instrument of relentless efficiency, emphasizing mechanization, discipline, and the merging of flesh with steel. His companies deployed with heavy support automata, armoured spearheads, and siege line precision. Their formation patterns on the drop site show deliberate order, parallel fire lanes, mechanised advance patterns, and overlapping suppression grids. The Iron Hands saw this engagement as an opportunity to restore their Primarch's honour after the earlier schism of Isstvan III, and to demonstrate absolute fidelity to the Imperium. The Salamanders arrived with the moral gravity that had always defined their legion. Vulkan's warriors favoured close order tactics, resilient armour, and fire discipline built upon the dual values of protection and endurance. Their arrival formations indicated an intent to hold rather than rush forward, and the early reports described them forming stabilising anchors between the more aggressive Iron Hands and the swift infiltration patterns of the Raven Guard. The Salamanders' objective was twofold: to secure a safe landing perimeter for subsequent waves, and to aid in the evacuation of any surviving Loyalist elements discovered among the ruins. The Raven Guard, meanwhile, embodied speed and adaptation. Their Primarch, Corvus Corax, had built his legion on stealth, reconnaissance, and precision strikes. At Isstvan V, the Raven Guard's role was to scout the depression, identify fortified sectors, and coordinate air insertion points. Their deployment pattern was wide, their communications brisk and fluid. Corax himself maintained a central command presence, attempting to link the operations of all 3 Loyalist forces into a coherent maneuver plan. The opposition, as presented to the Loyalists, appeared to consist of the known traitor legions, the Sons of Horus, the Emperor's Children, the Death Guard, and the World Eaters. In early transmissions, these forces were identified as having entrenched themselves within the Urgal Depression and adjacent canyons, employing heavy fortifications and entrenched gun emplacements. The actual scale and positioning of these forces were unknown to the Loyalist strategium due to both deliberate deception and electronic interference. The first encounters recorded by reconnaissance servitors and aerial picked feeds suggested limited resistance. The opening waves of Loyalist descent pods reported sporadic fire from entrenched positions but met no large-scale counterattack. Many in the vanguard interpreted this as a sign that the enemy's morale had collapsed under the weight of the War Master's prior planetary assaults. In retrospect, this lull represented calculated restraint. The traitor forces occupying the basin's defensive perimeter had been ordered to yield ground slowly, giving the impression of retreat while ensuring the Loyalist forces were drawn deeper into the killing field. As the first hours of combat unfolded, the Loyalist advance pushed through several lines of burnt-out ferrocrete bunkers and shattered gun nests. Raven Guard scouts reported empty trenches still smouldering, marked by ritual symbols and discarded armor plates belonging to various traitor legions. The Iron Hands, methodical and unflinching, advanced in phalanxes of armoured detachments, pressing deeper into the basin under sporadic bombardment. the Salamanders' rear elements constructed forward repair stations and medical shelters, a reflection of Vulkan's enduring concern for his warriors even amid apparent victory. At approximately the 4th hour of sustained engagement, Vox intercepts record the first sign of irregularity. Loyalist signals detected encrypted chatter among supposed ally legions in orbit, referencing Phase 2 readiness and alignment of firing coordinates. These transmissions were dismissed by surface commanders as procedural references, but they would later be identified as coded confirmations of betrayal sequences. The second wave of landings began soon after, consisting of the Wordbearers, Night Lords, and Iron Warriors, legions that the Loyalists still considered loyal to the Emperor at that moment. Their drop trajectories were coordinated through prearranged channels, intersecting with the rear formations of the Loyalist armies. When the second wave ships entered the atmosphere, Loyalist Vox operators welcomed them with coded identifications and vector assignments. Moments later, orbital picked feeds registered flare bursts, drop pod ignitions numbering in the thousands, descending in wide dispersal patterns around the basin perimeter. The Iron Hands assumed reinforcement lines were being established. The Salamanders continued consolidating their fortifications. Corax even adjusted his forward units to accommodate what he believed to be a tightening encirclement of the enemy. The trap was nearly complete. When the first betrayals occurred, they were sudden and catastrophic. Loyalist operators monitoring the approach of second-wave forces reported erratic identifications and unexplained silence from command channels. Then came the first bombardment. Orbital and ground-based artillery fire from the newly arrived legions began targeting Loyalist positions without warning. The Iron Hands' left flank disintegrated within minutes as overlapping barrages struck their armour formations. Ferrus Manus' personal command detachment reported immediate casualties among his senior officers as Iron Warriors' siege ordnance tore through the layered basalt ridges. The Night Lords attacked next, descending in lightning strike formations directly into the Loyalist rear lines, cutting through communications hubs and annihilating field medico stations. The betrayal spread across the basin in waves of fire and confusion. Vox channels became choked with overlapping distress calls. Raven Guard command nodes attempted to re-establish control, but their signal relays were being actively jammed. Reports describe Corax attempting to rally his companies, unaware that the flanking formations approaching under the banner of the Wordbearers were in fact preparing to open fire. When they did, it was methodical, precise, and merciless. The Salamanders found themselves assaulted from behind, their defensive emplacements struck by close-range melter fire from the very troops they had expected to relieve. Vulkan is recorded as having personally led several countercharges into this chaos, wielding his weapon in a futile attempt to carve open an escape route for his men. By the 6th hour of the massacre, the basin had become a cauldron of smoke, plasma discharge, and shattered armour. The Loyalists were caught in crossfire from multiple directions, with no opportunity to reorganise. The Iron Hands' mechanised formations attempted a push toward the central ridgeline, intending to link up with Raven Guard remnants. Aerial records indicate that Ferrus Manus himself engaged the Emperor's children at this point, confronting their Primarch Fulgrim directly. This duel, though described differently in surviving sources, is consistently placed as one of the final turning points of the battle. The Loyalists had already lost tactical cohesion. This confrontation merely symbolised the collapse of unity and trust among the Emperor's chosen sons. Elsewhere across the Depression, isolated groups of Loyalists formed defensive circles, attempting to hold out against overwhelming odds. Salamanders shielded wounded Raven Guard Marines as Night Lords descended through the smoke. Iron Hands detachments, their communications severed, fought until ammunition depletion forced them to engage in brutal close combat. Reports describe the ash turning into a slurry of blood and oil, the air thick with unspent propellant and the stench of burnt ceramite. The hostilities that followed were not brief executions but prolonged exterminations. Traitor legions did not rush to finish the battle. They systematically scoured each surviving position, eliminating resistance methodically. Wordbearer formations chanted invocations as they executed captives. Iron warriors encircled pockets of defenders and reduced them with siege guns from a distance. The Night Lords used the cover of the ashen storms to terrorize and pursue retreating survivors. Despite these conditions, remnants of the Raven Guard and Salamanders managed partial withdrawals under Corax's orders. Small units reached extraction points near the outer rim of the basin, though only a fraction of those transports succeeded in breaking through orbital interdiction. The Iron Hand suffered the heaviest losses. Many of their officers and tech marines perished alongside Ferrus Manus himself. Those who survived would later fragment into scattered warbands, their unity broken by grief and rage. By the battle's end, the Urgal Depression was a ruin of fire pits and shattered armour. Picked records recovered by later Mechanicus expeditions show entire plains covered in blackened power armour and the remnants of Titanic war engines. The War Master's forces established temporary occupation zones, collecting war spoils and recording kill counts for internal record keeping. None of the Loyalist formations remained as coherent fighting forces. It was at Isstvan V that the illusion of the Imperium's indivisible loyalty was shattered. The massacre marked the first large-scale open war between Primarchs, setting the course for the long, galactic civil war that would follow. The factions involved, both those that betrayed and those that endured, left Isstvan V changed forever. In the aftermath of the initial betrayal, the basin of the Urgal Depression descended into a drawn-out phase of extermination. The battle was effectively over within hours, yet the killing continued for days. Fires burned without interruption across the ridgelines. Ammunition detonations echoed through the volcanic valleys, lighting the ash storms in red and violet hues. The air grew thick with metallic vapour, and even Auspex readings were distorted by the density of particulate matter. Loyalist transmissions dwindled to brief bursts, simple survival reports or final oaths sworn into the void. The massacre was no longer a battle. It had become a cleansing operation executed with deliberate precision. The withdrawal attempts began almost immediately after the first orbital bombardments. Corvus Corax, realizing the scope of betrayal, issued fragmentary commands across broken Vox channels. He ordered all Raven Guard units to disengage and regroup toward the basin's perimeter ridges. His signal, recorded in overlapping frequencies, became a rallying cry that echoed across surviving command links. Fall back to the shadow line. The Raven Guard, utilizing their mobility and familiarity with stealth maneuvers, were able to extract several hundred warriors through concealed ravines and under the cover of ashen storms. Most of them were wounded or half-armed, carrying their dead on improvised stretchers. They abandoned vehicles, relics, and even armor components to minimize noise signatures. For these survivors, retreat was not a tactical maneuver, it was an act of preservation. The Salamanders suffered more heavily in these moments. Their sense of duty and their instinct to protect prevented many from withdrawing when they still could. Vulkan was last observed rallying survivors amid a collapsing defensive ring, his armor fractured and scorched from sustained bombardment. Multiple accounts describe him refusing extraction until he could account for as many of his warriors as possible. His final confirmed position was within the southeastern quadrant of the basin, where massed enemy fire obliterated the remaining Salamanders' formations. What happened to Vulkan immediately afterward remains subject to multiple interpretations, but all agree that his capture or disappearance marked the effective dissolution of his legion's presence at Isstvan V. For the Iron Hands, the end came with brutal suddenness. Ferrus Manus' duel with Fulgrim had become the symbolic centre of the battle, a meeting of conviction and betrayal. Fulgrim, the Primarch of the Emperor's Children, struck down Ferrus with his own blade. Some records claim that Fulgrim hesitated before delivering the killing blow, others that he was already lost to a corrupting influence beyond his comprehension. Regardless of interpretation, the death of Ferrus Manus was immediate and decisive. The Iron Hands formations that remained on the field faltered as command hierarchy disintegrated. Many attempted to recover their Primarch's remains, only to be obliterated by Emperor's Children detachments guarding the site of the duel. A handful succeeded in salvaging fragments of his armour and bionics, before retreating toward the northern ridge. Those fragments, later recovered by Loyalist agents, would become sacred relics of mourning for a legion that had lost its heart. By the time the last Loyalist positions were overrun, the Urgal Depression had transformed into a graveyard. The traitor legions advanced through the ruins methodically, securing every sector, destroying survivors, and burning all evidence of Imperial protocol. Death Guard detachments, under Mortarion's direct orders, deployed chemical saturation across low-lying ravines to ensure no living organisms remained. World Eater assault squads combed the periphery, executing wounded enemies with brutal efficiency. Wordbearers established temporary altar zones, performing ritualistic offerings amid the still-burning wreckage. The Emperor's children scavenged relics, genetic samples, and technology from the fallen, their actions driven as much by perverse fascination as by strategic necessity. The Loyalist remnants that escaped into the outer canyons faced pursuit for days. Raven Guard survivors recount being hunted by Night Lord's strike teams who used psychological warfare, distorted Vox broadcasts, imitated distress calls, and recorded screams of captured brothers to lure them out of hiding. Small groups evaded capture only through silence and darkness, moving by night and subsisting on emergency ration packs. By the time Corax reached the extraction zone, fewer than 2,000 of his legion's original deployment force remained capable of combat. The rest were either missing or presumed dead. Fleet records from orbit show that the Loyalist evacuation was chaotic and incomplete. A handful of dropships managed to break through the traitor blockade during the confusion following the initial bombardments. The rest were destroyed or forced back into the atmosphere. Salvage teams operating years later would identify the remains of dozens of downed Thunderhawks and troop carriers, most of them bearing the sigils of the Raven Guard or Salamanders. The data cores recovered from these wrecks were corrupted by radiation exposure but retained enough information to confirm last-minute escape attempts. Few succeeded. When the traitor forces finally secured the basin, the War Master's banners were raised over the scorched ground. Horus himself descended to the surface, accompanied by his inner circle. His inspection tour of the battlefield was brief but methodical. Reports from later archives note that he surveyed the carnage without expression. He gave orders to recover specific artifacts, among them the body of Ferrus Manus, and to transmit victory codes to his fleet. From orbit, the flagship Vengeful Spirit broadcast a declaration of triumph to all compliant sectors. The coded message referred to the engagement as Operation Culling, though in later centuries it would be remembered only by the title The Dropsite Massacre. The result of the event reverberated far beyond the Isstvan system. Within weeks, Imperial communication networks recorded sudden silences across dozens of subsectors. Loyalist command structures were thrown into disarray as news of the massacre reached Terra. The death of Ferrus Manus, the presumed death or capture of Vulkan, and the near annihilation of Corax's legion were immediate strategic losses. 3 of the Emperor's most stalwart legions had been effectively neutralized. Simultaneously, the revelation that so many others had joined the War Master solidified the reality that the Imperium was at war with itself. The heresy was no longer a contained rebellion. It had become a galactic civil war. The scale of destruction at Isstvan V also had long-term logistical and psychological consequences. The survivors of the Loyalist legions carried trauma that would shape their conduct for centuries. The Iron Hands fractured into independent clans, each consumed by guilt and rage, their obsession with mechanical purity deepening into near-fanatical extremes. The Salamanders, decimated and leaderless, turned inward, focusing on humanitarian reconstruction and the preservation of civilian lives whenever possible. The Raven Guard retreated into isolation, their numbers reduced and their gene seed nearly exhausted. Corax himself would spend the following years in desperate attempts to rebuild his legion through experimental means, a project that would later bring its own tragedies. Among the traitor legions, the massacre cemented a shared sense of triumph and inevitability. The Emperor's children glorified the event as a test of perfection. The Wordbearers viewed it as divine confirmation of their chosen faith, and the World Eaters celebrated it as a crucible of pure violence. The Iron Warriors saw it as the perfect siege operation, proof that calculation and ruthlessness could annihilate even the strongest defences. Horus, however, understood its true significance. The Dropsite Massacre was not only a tactical victory, it was a message. It demonstrated to all factions within the Imperium that the Warmaster possessed both the will and the capability to destroy even his closest brothers. The after-action records compiled by the few surviving Loyalists portray a battlefield stripped of humanity. Salvage teams returning years later found ossified armour shells fused to the volcanic glass. Melted bolter barrels lay embedded in cooling slag. In several sectors, entire squads had been vitrified by chemical agents or plasma bombardment. The surface of Isstvan V became a shrine of desolation, a monument to betrayal on a planetary scale. The Adeptus Mechanicus would later declare the Urgal Depression a forbidden zone, restricting further excavation except for controlled retrieval of relics under Magos supervision. It's important to note that despite the completeness of the massacre, resistance did not die entirely with the fallen. The survivors, scattered remnants of 3 legions, would regroup in time. Corax would return to deliver his testimony before the Emperor himself. The Salamanders, though diminished, would reappear on the front lines of later campaigns. Even fragments of the Iron Hands endured, their vengeance smouldering like the furnaces of their homeworld. The massacre was not the end of loyalty. It was the beginning of endurance through ruin. From an analytical perspective, the overall result of the Dropsite Massacre reshaped the military balance of the heresy. The Warmaster eliminated 1/3 of the Imperium's immediate strike capability, while consolidating his alliances with at least half of the known legions. The psychological damage to Imperial morale was incalculable. Many worlds, upon hearing the outcome, renounced allegiance to terror out of fear or confusion. The Emperor's strategic response shifted from proactive suppression to defensive containment. Terror began preparing for siege. Thus, the massacre on Isstvan V stands not merely as a battlefield tragedy, but as a fulcrum upon which galactic history turned. It is the point at which trust between brothers became impossible, and where the dream of unity, built over centuries of conquest, collapsed under the weight of pride and deceit. Every subsequent campaign of the Horus Heresy traces its lineage to the ashes of that basin, where loyalty and betrayal met in their purest forms. The closing records, compiled by Imperial archivists centuries later, conclude with a final annotation. From this day the sons of the Emperor cease to be one. The ashes of Isstvan remain as witness. The records preserved by the Adeptus Administratum regarding the Isstvan V campaign are among the most fragmentary of the entire heresy. The surviving data fragments are drawn from hundreds of partial reports, broken cipher transmissions and ship logs recovered centuries after the event. When the massacre occurred, no direct administratum presence had been formally established on Isstvan V. The planet was under martial occupation and military jurisdiction. As such, civilian record-keeping and logistical oversight fell largely to expeditionary logisticians and mechanicum logistici adepti. Later, during the Great Scouring, the Administratum reconstructed much of its analytical framework through recovered Nuspheric echoes and mechanicum data shards found embedded within the ruins of the Warmaster's forward command nodes. The Administratum's analytical tone regarding the event was neutral but markedly grim. They identified Isstvan V as a strategic convergence point of unparalleled misjudgment. The Loyalist counterattack had been based on assumptions of mutual oaths, communication fidelity, and interlegion coordination that the data did not justify. Early after-action audits from the recovered reports indicated that the Loyalist supply lines had been compressed into narrow planetary descent corridors, optimized for speed and precision, but leaving no logistical redundancy. Each drop formation carried limited surface refueling capacity and minimal extraction capability. The Administratium later assessed this as a catastrophic compression of assets. The Loyalist legions committed nearly 80% of their available planetary deployment material during the initial waves. When the betrayal began, the sudden loss of orbital control rendered all subsequent supply projections meaningless. From the perspective of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the battle became an engineering case study in total systemic collapse. The Mechanicum's forged kin attached to the Loyalist legions, most notably to the Salamanders and the Iron Hands, recorded several thousand Logica entries detailing the degradation of drop transport integrity. Some logs recovered from the remnants of the Iron Hands fleet describe atmospheric entry systems failing in succession due to electromagnetic interference emanating from the Warmaster's own fleet in low orbit. It is theorized that the traitor forces had pre-programmed their Auspex and counter-vox arrays to jam specific machine codes associated with Loyalist descent operations. The Adeptus Administratum reconstructed this phenomenon under the term signal fracturing, the deliberate corruption of machine language packets to create cascading synchronization failures between descending dropships and orbiting carriers. According to their mathematical modeling, even a single corrupted command line could desynchronize an entire descent pattern. As a result, dozens of drop pods and landers collided mid-descent, or impacted the surface at lethal velocities, dispersing men and material across unintended landing zones. This led to a chaotic distribution of Loyalist formations across the battlefield. Mechanicum analysts later quantified the material losses. Of the initial landing wave, approximately 37% of drop vehicles suffered catastrophic failure before or during descent. Of the remainder, nearly half were destroyed within the first 4 hours of ground engagement. Estimates place total material loss, including armoured vehicles, ammunition, and orbital landing craft, at over 68% of initial deployment strength. For context, such a level of loss would be comparable to the total material destruction of an entire Crusade campaign force during a decade-long war, compressed into less than a single Terran day. The Administratum's evaluation of manpower was equally devastating. Based on the fragmented tallies recovered from Vox data and post-battle scryings, the Loyalist casualties exceeded 120,000 Astartes equivalent combatants. The actual figure is uncertain due to the complete vaporization of several landing sites during the orbital bombardments. Mechanicus data scribes later confirmed the absence of biosignature traces consistent with full Legion cohorts, suggesting entire units were annihilated at the molecular level by sustained plasma and melter bombardment. What remains particularly striking in both the Administratum and Mechanicum analyses is their unemotional language. The reports refer to biological asset degradation and termination of command nodes, rather than death or slaughter. The Mechanicus identified the betrayal not as a moral tragedy, but as a machine state inversion, a reversal of intended purpose in which the system components, legions, turned on their core directive, Imperial unity. To them, it represented a failure in hierarchical logic and predictive modelling rather than loyalty or emotion. The logistical pattern of betrayal, as reconstructed by the Administratum's later scholars, follows a disturbing precision. The Warmaster's forces had evidently studied Loyalist drop trajectories and used pre-marked topographic grids to determine where Loyalist formations would land. Heavy weapons detachments from the Iron Warriors and Emperor's Children were already entrenched in high elevation ridges surrounding the main drop zones. Mortarian's Death Guard established biochemical saturation points along expected reinforcement corridors, while the Sons of Horus secured the central killing field. This produced a situation wherein the Loyalist legions were surrounded within hours, without the enemy needing to maneuver extensively. The Adeptus Mechanicus, analysing the aftermath centuries later, referred to this tactical construct as a kinetic net. It was not merely an ambush, but a predictive algorithm applied to the geography of warfare. Every Loyalist vector of advance had been pre-mapped, every artillery angle computed, every ridge optimised for overlapping arcs of fire. To the Mechanicus, it demonstrated a level of premeditation equivalent to a machine-perfect execution of betrayal. The Warmaster's forces had weaponized mathematics. From an operational standpoint, both the Administratum and the Mechanicus found the Loyalists' pre-battle intelligence lacking. The Administratum's archivist noted that the Loyalist command assumed the presence of only 3 traitor legions on the surface, when in truth 7 had already declared for the Warmaster. The Mechanicus identified this as a failure of predictive patterning and networked reconnaissance. No data from Isstvan III had been fully decoded prior to the drop, leaving Loyalist forces blind to the scale of the conspiracy. The lack of pre-battle reconnaissance drones and Auspex sweeps was later criticised as one of the most significant oversights of the heresy's early phase. In reviewing the battlefield aftermath, Mechanicum tech seers dispatched during the Great Scouring discovered widespread contamination of data crystals and vox logs. Many had been deliberately corrupted with null data loops or embedded scrap code. Attempts to recover intact recordings often triggered defensive machine spirits that self-purged or melted the data cores. This raised suspicions within the Mechanicum that the War Master's own Dark Mechanicum allies had seeded the field with recursive data viruses designed to erase all traceable records of their methods. The Adeptus Administratum concluded that the Isstvan V Massacre was not merely a failed campaign, but an intentional logistical trap. It was engineered to draw out Loyalist strength and annihilate it in a single decisive event. The Mechanicum concurred, classifying the battle as a total inversion event, a scenario in which all predictive outcomes favouring Imperial victory were mathematically inverted through manipulation of command data and machine code interference. By the close of their combined analyses, both institutions reached a chilling consensus. The massacre had not only destroyed half of the Loyalist legions, but also corrupted the very systems used to record and understand it. For centuries afterward, Mechanicum archivists referred to the event as a black algorithm, a point in time where data ceased to obey logic. Administratum historians, constrained by their own bureaucratic lexicon, simply recorded it as Isstvan V, the locus of annihilation. Despite the mechanistic detachment of these reports, the underlying truth is one of logistical obliteration. Every vector, from communication to resupply, from command relay to battlefield recovery, was severed. The planet itself became a graveyard of war machines and men whose identities were later reconstructed only by armor fragment serials. For the Adeptus Administratum, Isstvan V represented the greatest recorded loss of organized manpower in a single planetary assault in Imperial history. For the Adeptus Mechanicus, it marked the birth of a corrupted logic in warfare, the moment the machine turned upon its own programming. It was not simply a massacre of armies, but a dismantling of the Imperial war machine itself. The data shows no redemption, no correction, and no recovery, only silence, followed by centuries of corrupted echoes across the void. The analysis of the Isstvan V campaign by the Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus extends beyond the initial slaughter. Both institutions, centuries later, identified within the massacre multiple sub-engagements that, though part of the same greater event, carried the complexity and brutality of entire wars in themselves. These sub-battles were reconstructed not through eyewitness accounts, most of those had perished, but through cross-analysis of telemetry fragments, terrain erosion patterns, and the few surviving pick captures transmitted before system collapse. The most frequently cited engagement is the so-called Iron Hands descent, recorded in the surviving data logs of the Fist of Iron, a battle barge that served as one of the final command ships of the X-Legion before its destruction in low orbit. According to recovered fragments, the Iron Hands deployed their forces in a tight phalanx formation, their dropships landing in sequential waves with metronomic precision. They advanced toward the central basin of Isstvan V's northern plain, a terrain composed of hardened volcanic glass and slag ridges. Initial seismic readings confirm that the terrain, though stable under standard infantry weight, fractured under the mass of armoured vehicles. The Iron Hands' characteristic discipline in maintaining rigid combat lines became a liability. The rigid geometry of their formation made them vulnerable to crossfire from traitor artillery emplacements, already zeroed in on predicted drop coordinates. The Iron Hands' fighting style, normally an expression of mechanical efficiency and unrelenting forward motion, met its first true test against an enemy who not only anticipated their approach, but had engineered the terrain to collapse beneath them. The Death Guard's siege specialists had seeded the approach zones with high-yield corrosive shells that destabilized the crust before Loyalist impact. This caused multiple tanks to sink into pockets of molten slag, effectively immobilizing their armoured spearhead within the first hour. Mechanicus data later confirmed that upwards of 40 armoured vehicles were lost not to direct enemy fire, but to engineered terrain sabotage, a tactic that the War Master's generals had calculated days before the first Loyalist ships entered orbit. Further south, the Raven Guard initiated a rapid assault intended to flank the traitor positions. Their fighting style, fast, silent and surgical, was uniquely suited for precision warfare and covert infiltration. However, the Raven Guard's descent patterns were intercepted and decrypted mid-transmission by the Sons of Horus. Vox records suggest that traitor interference redirected several drop pods into kill zones, pre-marked with chemical dispersal devices. Atmospheric analysis from Mechanicus surveys centuries later found residues of the Death Guard's bioalchemic agents across those coordinates, proof that the Loyalist drop zones were deliberately saturated before their arrival. The Raven Guard's attempt to regroup under the command of Corvus Corax faltered under the sheer density of the ambush. The War Master's ground batteries forced the Loyalists into a disorganized retreat toward the Isstvan Basin's southern trench network. Here, the fighting devolved into chaos. Surviving Raven Guard reports describe corridors filled with black smoke and shattered ceramite, where visibility dropped to less than 2 meters. They fought in near blindness, relying solely on Auspex echoes and the instinctive discipline of the Legion. The combination of chemical warfare, artillery suppression, and pre-calibrated ambush zones rendered their stealth useless. The most tragic and well-documented phase of the battle, however, occurred within the Salamanders' line of advance. Vulkan's forces, known for their resilience and close-quarter endurance, were among the first to detect the irregularities in communication from the traitor lines. Several surviving fragments of their command vox show recorded confusion at the apparent absence of Iron Warriors' resistance in expected positions. Instead, the Salamanders encountered a hollowed expanse filled with abandoned fortifications, bait for their advance. As the Legion pushed forward, they came under concentrated orbital bombardment from the very ships they believed were allies. The Salamanders' combat doctrine emphasized humanitarian conduct and the preservation of life even in the midst of destruction. Against the War Master's betrayal, these virtues became liabilities. Their natural inclination to rescue wounded Astartes, whether loyalist or not, led them repeatedly into zones saturated with incendiary munitions and plasma fire. The Adeptus Mechanicus later simulations show that the Salamander's casualty rate in the first 8 hours reached 80%. Entire companies were incinerated as they formed protective perimeters around downed brothers. From a tactical standpoint, the Loyalists displayed extraordinary adaptability under catastrophic conditions. The Iron Hands attempted to re-establish command synchronization using encrypted sub-bands. The Raven Guard initiated counter-recon sweeps using short-range Auspex bursts. The Salamanders attempted to anchor a central defense at the basin's rim, rallying remnants from all 3 Loyalist legions. Yet each maneuver was systematically anticipated and countered. The traitor legions maintained near-perfect coordination, a fact the Adeptus Mechanicus later attributed to the presence of pre-coded algorithmic command sequences running through their Vox networks. These sequences, termed macro-predictive relays, allowed the traitor generals to execute synchronized multi-vector offensives even amid the chaos of battle. The Iron Warriors' contribution to the massacre was particularly defining. Their siege batteries established overlapping arcs of heavy ordnance across the basin's perimeter. Each time Loyalist forces attempted to regroup, they found themselves under immediate suppressive fire. The Iron Warriors' preferred weaponry, quad mortars, basilisk derivatives and thermic lance batteries, created an unbroken field of destruction. Their firing cadence was mathematically calculated to prevent any lull in bombardment, long enough for Loyalists to mount counterattacks. In essence, the Loyalists were trapped in a continuous firestorm. Mechanicus observers, studying the orbital patterns centuries later, noted that the War Master's fleet maintained synchronized bombardment cycles with ground-based artillery. Every 32 seconds, a new pattern of impact waves struck the surface, precisely timed with shifts in Loyalist movement. The precision implied more than human coordination. Some Mechanicus Magi have suggested that elements of the Dark Mechanicum employed predictive machine algorithms capable of mapping Loyalist trajectories through battlefield telemetry. Although this theory remains unconfirmed, the data anomalies found within recovered orbital command files lend it credibility. One of the more infamous microbattles within the Greater Massacre was the Iron Hands counterattack led by Ferrus Manus himself. Fragmentary data suggests that Manus advanced deep into the traitor lines, seeking confrontation with Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children. The Mechanicus recorded this duel as an irreversible divergence event, the moment when the Brotherhood of the Primarchs dissolved beyond repair. Although the Administratum's historical record marks Ferrus Manus' death as occurring within the final hours of the battle, the Mechanicus claim that the engagement was both symbolic and tactical, marking the collapse of Loyalist morale. Following the death of Manus, encrypted command bursts ceased entirely across the Loyalist Vox spectrum. Coordination fell apart. Units fought in isolation, unaware that their Primarch had fallen. Meanwhile, Mortarion's Death Guard demonstrated the efficiency of attrition warfare at its most horrifying scale. Their combat doctrine favoured grinding endurance and area denial through chemical saturation. They released toxic payloads into the trenches and ravines, creating zones of decay that neutralised Loyalist survivors regardless of armour resilience. The Mechanicus later reconstructed these agents as hyper-evolved phage compounds capable of bonding to ceramite and gradually decomposing its structure. For those trapped beneath compromised armour, death came not from impact or explosion, but from suffocation within a collapsing shell. Even the Emperor's Children, whose doctrine prized precision and perfection, indulged in excessive brutality during the battle. They advanced in meticulously coordinated spearheads, eliminating isolated groups of Loyalists with surgical strikes. Some Administratum archivists have noted the disturbing regularity of their maneuvers, describing them as the choreography of betrayal. The Mechanicus data suggests that their sonic weaponry, early forms of the noise generators that would later define their legion, caused widespread neurological interference among nearby troops, leading to confusion and disorientation. As the battle entered its final phases, the Loyalist lines disintegrated entirely. Surviving detachments attempted withdrawal toward extraction points on the western plain, but their paths were blocked by the sons of Horus and the Word-Bearers. The latter's use of incendiary ordnance and corrupted warp phenomena rendered the escape corridors impassable. The Mechanicus reconstruction of this engagement describes entire platoons disappearing from bioscan within seconds, their signal signatures replaced by static distortions. This phenomenon remains unexplained but is believed to involve localized warp breaches initiated by the traitor librarians. The Administratum classified the entirety of the Isstvan V Massacre as a single battle of annihilation, but within that framework it contained dozens of distinct engagements, each with its own geography, tactics, and horror. From the Iron Hands' armoured advance to the Raven Guard's trench warfare, from the Salamanders' humanitarian stand to the traitor's algorithmic precision, every element converged into a single, engineered slaughter. In post-battle analysis, the Adeptus Mechanicus categorized the conflict according to three operational phases. Phase 1, Descent and Entrapment. Phase 2, Suppression and Attrition. Phase 3, Extermination and Obfuscation. The last phase is particularly significant. During this stage, the traitor forces ceased open combat and began the deliberate eradication of evidence. Orbital strikes vaporized corpses, data nodes, and vehicles alike. Surveillance arrays were dismantled or booby-trapped with scrap code payloads. In some regions, Mechanicus analysts detected residual energy fields consistent with data denial systems, machines built solely to erase all record of what had transpired. The fighting style across both sides reflected their philosophies. The Loyalists fought with honour, cohesion and defiance until their formations collapsed. The traitors fought with mathematical cruelty, employing every weapon of precision and deception to maximum effect. It was not a battle of courage but of calculation. The War Master's victory was predetermined, not earned on the field but constructed through logistics, foresight and betrayal. In the cold summaries of the Mechanicus and Administratum archives, the massacre is no longer described as a battle, but as a calculated war form. It was warfare transformed into an algorithm, perfected for destruction. The Loyalists bled and died within a closed equation, one designed to end not only their lives but the very structure of trust upon which the Imperium had been built. The Isstvan V Massacre stands as the exemplar of engineered warfare, a model of tactical manipulation so precise that even millennia later, no simulation has successfully recreated its predictive perfection. It was not chaos that triumphed there, but design. And through that design, the galaxy learned that loyalty could be quantified and betrayal could be weaponized. The Isstvan V Dropsite Massacre did not end when the guns fell silent. Its echoes extended across decades of warfare, shaping both Imperial and traitor military doctrine for centuries. The Adeptus Administratum categorized the immediate aftermath as the onset of the Fracture Wars, a broad term encompassing the series of retaliatory campaigns, counteroffensives, and extermination operations that followed the War Master's betrayal. The Adeptus Mechanicus, meanwhile, viewed Isstvan V not as a singular engagement, but as the foundational algorithm for a new form of warfare, one defined by betrayal as a tactical mechanism. Administratum records detail that in the 2 solar years following the massacre, over 35 planetary engagements were directly connected to the remnants of the Isstvan disaster. The survivors, fragmented, leaderless, and psychologically broken, attempted to regroup across several sectors. Surviving companies of the Salamanders and Raven Guard fled to nearby systems such as Obsidia, Polyphemus, and Trugoi, where they established emergency strongholds. The Iron Hand survivors, fewer still, splintered into autonomous warbands led by surviving captains, each retaining fragments of Ferrus Manus's final directives. One notable engagement was the Trugoi Reclamation, a minor but violent conflict that erupted when a contingent of Iron Hand survivors attempted to seize a Mechanicum supply depot. Administratum transcripts from the surviving records classify it as a Category Delta reclamation attempt. The Iron Hands, driven by a desire to rebuild their shattered arsenal, attacked under the assumption that the Mechanicum forces stationed there remained loyal to Mars. They were met instead by detachments of Dark Mechanicum elements already allied to the War Master. The ensuing battle lasted 18 hours and ended in total annihilation of the Loyalist survivors. The Mechanicus data extracted later from orbital debris identified the presence of experimental demon engines, marking one of the earliest confirmed instances of corrupted Mechanicum technology deployed in open battle. The Raven Guard's attempts at recovery culminated in what the Administratum later designated the Deliverance Exodus. According to Mechanicus orbital logs, several damaged Raven Guard vessels, including the Avenger and Shadowed Hand, escaped Isstvan V's orbit under heavy fire, only to suffer catastrophic reactor failures due to embedded scrap code infections. It was these infections, malicious code fragments transferred from traitor communications arrays, that would plague the Legion for decades. Entire machine systems aboard their ships became unstable, rendering navigation erratic and supply chains unpredictable. Administratum analysts later concluded that the War Master's use of corrupted data streams had effectively weaponized the Mechanicum's reliance on automation. The result was a logistical plague, a self-replicating disruption of command networks that crippled Loyalist fleet mobility. The data collapse following Isstvan V set back the Loyalist effort across the entire Northern Galactic Quadrant, delaying organised counteroffensives until Millennia 41, year 305. The Salamanders, traditionally resilient and humanitarian, suffered irreparable fragmentation. Their command echelons were largely obliterated alongside their Primarch Vulkan, who was presumed dead following the massacre. The few who survived became scattered across the void, continuing isolated rescue operations. Administratum codices record dozens of uncoordinated relief efforts, led by detached Salamanders strike teams, attempting to evacuate wounded Astartes from other compromised systems. Many of these missions failed, but a handful succeeded, saving hundreds of lives that would later contribute to the rebuilding of shattered legions during the Scouring. The Adeptus Mechanicus, reviewing these subsequent events, found in them a clear demonstration of systemic collapse following a single point of betrayal. The Isstvan V Massacre was not simply an ambush, but a deliberate deconstruction of the Imperial war apparatus at multiple levels: physical, informational, and psychological. The War Master's forces had demonstrated the efficacy of layered sabotage, attacking the Imperium not by brute force but by severing the interdependencies that made it function. Supply networks, machine alliances, data integrity, and chain of command cohesion all were disrupted in one synchronized strike. The battle's aftermath extended even to Mars. The Mechanicum Schism, known as the Martian Civil War, was heavily influenced by the revelations from Isstvan V. Tech priests loyal to the Omnissiah saw in the massacre the undeniable proof of technological corruption. Those seduced by the Dark Mechanicum viewed it as liberation from Imperial orthodoxy. Administratum records from later centuries confirm that the data corruption patterns found in the Isstvan archives were nearly identical to those found in Martian forge hives during the civil conflict. From a macro-historical perspective, Isstvan V functioned as the pivot upon which the Great Crusade turned into the Horus Heresy proper. The Administratum's logistical charts show a sudden inversion of resource allocation immediately after the massacre. Supply lines, once directed toward exploration and compliance, were redirected to rearmament and counterinsurgency. The number of shipyards designated for offensive operations dropped by 42%, while those converted to repair or retrofitting increased by 60%. In practical terms, this signaled the end of Imperial expansion and the beginning of sustained internal warfare. The Adeptus Mechanicus long-range surveys of Isstvan V itself reveal a battlefield frozen in chemical death. Even 10,000 years later, the surface retains traces of fused ceramite, crystallized organics, and radioactive ash fields that defy reclamation. Attempts at excavation frequently trigger dormant machine spirits still running corrupted logic loops. The planet remains classified as interdicted under Mechanicus decree, a machine graveyard unsuitable for habitation or study without extreme caution. Administratum archivists later classified the Isstvan system as a memorial region, though no monuments exist there. The logistical records label it simply as Zone Null. Even within the Mechanicus archives, no authorized pilgrimage or recovery mission has been sanctioned since the end of the heresy. Every probe sent to its surface has either failed or returned incomprehensible data. The Adeptus Mechanicus attributes this to high scrap code contamination. Others quietly suggest that the battlefield itself remains haunted by machine ghosts, corrupted logic constructs echoing the final orders of long-dead commanders. In terms of measurable aftermath, the Administratum's analytical model estimates that the massacre delayed the Imperium's galactic unification by at least 6 standard centuries. The loss of manpower, material, and command continuity forced the Emperor's remaining loyal forces into a purely defensive stance for generations. The Mechanicus recorded similar effects across technological supply chains. Forge worlds that once coordinated their output under the unified banner of Mars became autonomous, some ceasing contact entirely. The once perfect logistical harmony of the Great Crusade fractured irreparably. For the War Master's forces, the massacre represented the successful validation of betrayal as a primary war doctrine. The traitor legions replicated its principles throughout the subsequent years of the heresy. The Siege of Terror, the Battle of Molech, and the Scouring of Paramar all bore the hallmarks of Isstvan's methodology: false intelligence, predictive encirclement, and total annihilation. Mechanicus battle analytics describe these engagements as derivative events, each modelled upon the original algorithmic warfare perfected on Isstvan V. When the Administratum compiled its final report on the campaign, it classified the Isstvan V massacre as a terminal engagement, meaning an event beyond recovery or rectification. The closing analysis reads as follows: all systems failed concurrently: command, data, faith, and flesh. The sum of these failures equals extinction. The Adeptus Mechanicus's own final report is even more succinct. Translated from Benheric, it reads, "The pattern corrupted itself. correction impossible. Yet despite their dispassionate conclusions, both institutions recognized the massacre as a lesson. The Administratum incorporated Isstvan V into its military education doctrines, labeling it a model of catastrophic misjudgment in operational trust. The Adeptus Mechanicus, meanwhile, adopted new doctrines of data isolation and machine purity, restricting cross-network communication between legions and ensuring that no future campaign could be compromised through similar interference. In retrospective simulation studies conducted millennia later, Mechanicus Magi attempted to replicate the conditions of the massacre to determine if it could have been prevented. The results were conclusive. Even with perfect foresight and total resource availability, the Loyalist forces would still have suffered devastating losses. The betrayal had been architected with such precision that survival was statistically impossible. The War Master's victory was not a matter of superiority, but inevitability. Administratum historians often summarize the event in a single equation: Isstvan equals trust divided by death. It became a cornerstone in Imperial military philosophy, a grim reminder that loyalty, once corrupted, could destroy entire civilizations faster than any weapon. In the final consensus between the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Isstvan V Dropsite Massacre stands as both a technical study and a moral indictment. The data shows no errors of courage or valor, only errors of belief. The Imperium's greatest sons descended together in unity and died in isolation, their fall recorded not in words but in corrupted code and silence. For the Administratum, it remains the definitive cautionary event, a logistical tragedy born of trust misplaced. For the Mechanicus, it is a reminder of the fragility of the machine's purity when touched by human ambition. For the galaxy, it was the moment the Emperor's dream shattered and the fires of the heresy began to consume all that followed. And in the quiet vacuum beyond the ruined planet, the corrupted signals of Isstvan V still echo, untranslated, unending, and untouched since the day the Imperium betrayed itself. Archived Vox logs and sealed Inquisition transcripts concerning the Isstvan V Dropsite Massacre have long been marked under the classification Hereticus Maxima, accessible only to specific Ordo Hereticus and Ordo Xenos branches. The reasoning behind this unusual overlap remains unclear, though it implies that the massacre, while a product of human treachery, may also have carried anomalies that extended beyond mere mortal deceit. The first reports analysed by inquisitorial scholars date back to the immediate aftermath of the betrayal, retrieved from what little survived of the Loyalist communications network. The picked feeds were heavily corrupted, with timestamps looping erratically, displaying chronometric discrepancies ranging from several minutes to entire hours. This suggested either severe orbital interference from the massive fleet bombardments or an unexplained warping of local time fields, perhaps residual from the psychic screams that echoed across the valley during the massacre. Among the most studied of these corrupted records is one identified as Record 59 Theta, reportedly captured by a Raven Guard recon automaton before it was destroyed. The footage presents a desolate plain littered with shattered armour and blackened ceramite. But what the Inquisition found remarkable was the fluctuating distortion across the image, as if the air itself had been bending light in irregular intervals. Tech priests originally attributed this to heat distortion, but subsequent analysis ruled out atmospheric interference entirely. The distortion pattern bore resemblance to what the Ordo Malleus describes as minor empiric interference fields, a phenomenon typically seen in areas recently exposed to warp energy or intense psychic trauma. The existence of such residual energy on Isstvan V raised disturbing questions that, according to later sources, the Mechanicus preferred left unaddressed. The Inquisition also noted discrepancies in the biological readings of the slain. Corpses retrieved weeks after the massacre displayed abnormal degradation rates. While most human and Astartes tissue decomposes predictably under Isstvan's temperate conditions, several of the recovered remains were found desiccated far beyond what natural decay could produce. The Mechanicus attributed this to thermal exposure and weapon heat residue. Yet some Inquisition Medica reports describe cases where decay patterns mirrored radiation burns or low-level warp exposure. In several documented cases, metallic implants and armor fragments fused to the bone through unexplained molecular alteration, an effect consistent neither with melter nor plasma damage. The Adeptus Mechanicus refused to comment directly on these biological anomalies, citing data corruption and field contamination. Yet in sealed Ordo Hereticus appendices, several Magos biologies expressed concern that the psychic resonance left behind by the massacre might have altered the local biosignature of the battlefield. It was suggested, though never confirmed, that the psychic agony of 10,000 Astartes dying in betrayal may have caused a form of collective psychic echo, a metaphysical scar embedded in the terrain. The Inquisition has since prohibited the establishment of any settlement or outpost in the region, designating the valley as a memory field, a location unsuitable for habitation due to unquantified psychic feedback. Beyond the physical and psychic anomalies, the Inquisition's impression of the event was defined by the emotional tenor of the survivors. Of those who escaped, mainly scattered remnants of the Salamanders, Iron Hands and Raven Guard, many displayed what modern inquisitors might classify as post-traumatic psychic instability. Some were found in catatonic states, others ranting incoherently about seeing ghosts of iron or voices in the fire. The reports from apothecaries attempting to stabilize them describe heightened sensory hallucinations, suggesting psychic oversaturation, possibly triggered by the massacre's scale and emotional intensity. The Inquisition has long debated whether these visions were products of psychological trauma or something more profound, an imprint of the warp drawn by the betrayal's intensity. The Order Xenos, though tangentially involved, took interest due to the discovery of foreign biological residue in the ash layer beneath the battlefield strata. Trace organic material not native to Astartes' physiology was identified in 2 separate excavations. It matched no known Xenos species, and its composition, rich in iridescent protein structures, suggested synthetic bioengineering. The Ordo Xenos postulated it may have been remnants of Mechanicus sensor drone components or transmuted Astartes gene material exposed to warp radiation, but the matter was never officially resolved. The specimens were sealed in cryostasis and sent to the Lathe Worlds, from which no further data emerged. In one of the more controversial sealed Inquisition findings, dated Millennia 31, year 412, a rogue psyker under interrogation claimed to have seen the massacre within the Imperium. According to the transcript, the psyker described Isstvan V as a place where reality thinned, a wound carved by faith betrayed. While the testimony was dismissed as delusion, it was later annotated by an Order Malleus operative who noted that the psychic topography of Isstvan V remained unstable for centuries. Warp storms periodically aligned with the system, suggesting a localized anchor or scar within the Imperium structure. Inquisitors examining these findings often disagreed on their interpretation. The Ordo Hereticus viewed the Isstvan V massacre primarily as a cautionary symbol, the moment when mankind's own hubris nearly undid the Emperor's work. The Ordo Malleus, conversely, saw it as a site of lingering psychic contamination, an open wound upon the materium where loyalty, faith, and reality itself fractured. The Ordo Xenos saw the potential of undisclosed external interference, though few dared to document it beyond passing mention. The event became, in their collective analysis, not just the first major betrayal of the Horus Heresy, but also a metaphysical collapse of trust so profound that it altered the warp's reflection of humanity itself. The most unexplainable finding, however, lies in a single sealed Mechanicus transmission decoded centuries later. The message, labelled Isstvan Field Log Beta 3, contains partial data referring to an unknown energy discharge, recorded immediately after the death of Ferrus Manus. The signature was described as neither plasma nor warp-based, but subatomic resonance consistent with deep phase energy fluctuation. While the Mechanicus could not classify it, Inquisition investigators later cross-referenced the readings with those from the destruction of Prospero and found faint parallels. Both events shared anomalous subspace echoes following mass psychic trauma. This led some to speculate that the death of a Primarch, particularly under Betrayal, could create a measurable disturbance within reality, a psychic shockwave detectable across systems. Despite numerous investigations and data analyses, the Inquisition has never published an official conclusion. All records remain locked within the archives of Terra's Tricorn Palace, accessible only under multi-seal clearance. Those who have studied them describe the massacre as an event that transcended mere warfare. It represented a convergence point, a moment when mortal decision, divine ambition, and the raw energy of the warp aligned in destructive harmony. What began as a military betrayal evolved into something greater, a permanent fissure in the psychic identity of humanity. Even now, millennia later, Isstvan V stands as a symbol of the Imperium's deepest wound, not only in history but in the unseen strata of reality itself. The Isstvan V Massacre, as chronicled within Inquisition archives, exists not merely as a historical tragedy, but as an event whose aftershocks seem to reverberate across the Imperium's timeline in ways both subtle and inexplicable. Whether Mechanicus sought patterns of energy decay and the Administratum pursued logistical explanations, the Inquisition instead identified a series of war zone irregularities, occurrences that defied conventional analysis, repeating across later battlefields that shared an inexplicable resonance with Isstvan's psychic footprint. To this day, these anomalies remain categorized under sealed designation Epsilon Red, a classification reserved for events in which recorded fact and sensory observation diverge irreconcilably. The first anomaly appeared during the Thrammers Crusade decades later. Several inquisitorial historians have drawn attention to the eerie similarities between the recorded Vox interference patterns during the Thrammers engagements and those captured from the corrupted pict feeds on Isstvan V. Both displayed identical data distortion intervals, precisely 42 milliseconds apart. This would be unremarkable if not for the fact that these signals originated from entirely separate systems under different atmospheric and technological conditions. Furthermore, the interference intensity followed the exact same sinusoidal curve observed at Isstvan, something no known signal corruption caused naturally. Some datacasters within the Order Malleus theorized that this distortion might be a lingering psychic echo, a template burned into the immaterium by the betrayal, remanifesting during future mass fratricides. The Mechanicus dismissed such speculation, but the Inquisition preserved the data all the same. The second anomaly involved conflicting time signatures found within multiple post-massacre reports. Loyalist forces that escaped Isstvan V, particularly elements of the Raven Guard, recorded contradictory accounts of when key events occurred. Vox records indicate that the orbital bombardment began several minutes after the War Master's signal, yet flight logs from strikecraft indicate that atmospheric detonations occurred before orbital confirmation was received. The discrepancy was not minor, it spanned up to 20 minutes across overlapping data streams. The Mechanicus attributed this to disruption of the noospheric relay grid, but an Ordo Chronos cell, before its disbandment, later postulated that the very fabric of local causality had been affected by mass psychic trauma, briefly bending time in chaotic oscillation. This theory remains unconfirmed but was considered plausible enough to warrant the sealing of temporal readings from the Isstvan system indefinitely. A more disturbing pattern arose in the subsequent centuries. During the Reign of Blood, and later during the Badab War, Adeptus Astartes records mention auditory phenomena eerily identical to those reported by survivors of the massacre. Metallic echoes in Vox channels described as hammering iron beneath the earth. The Iron Hand survivors of Isstvan, many of whom later integrated into successor chapters, claimed these sounds mirrored the last rhythmic strikes of Ferrus Manus's hammer before his death. No recording has ever captured the phenomenon directly, yet dozens of accounts persist across millennia. Whether auditory hallucination or psychic residue, the consistency of the reports has drawn sustained inquisitorial interest. Perhaps the most documented anomaly lies in the repeated failure of orbital Auspex systems attempting to scan the Isstvan V surface in the years following the heresy. Every expedition, Imperial, Mechanicus, or Inquisition reported unpredictable interference, not merely atmospheric but in the deeper electromagnetic spectrum. In some instances, the scans returned images that seemed temporally displaced, battlefields reappearing in pristine condition, dead Astartes standing as if alive, war machines mid-stride. One particular image, dated Millennia 31, year 470, depicts what appears to be a fully intact Iron Hands formation marching through the canyon floor, despite there being no living Astartes recorded in that region for centuries. Attempts to replicate the scan failed, and the Mechanicus purged the archive of the image. However, Ordo Malleus archivists retained a degraded copy under the seal Spectral Manifest 05. There are further accounts, sealed within Segmentum Solar archives, describing human expeditions to the Isstvan system during the Great Scouring. In one recorded case, a detachment of Custodian Guard investigating the planetary remains reported transient light phenomena resembling silhouettes of Primarch-scale figures on the horizon. The Custodians made no official comment, but their accompanying remembrancer, a non-augmented human artist, sketched what he saw before his death. The drawing, though crude, depicts two immense figures locked in combat, one bearing a blade that glowed with unnatural brilliance, the other a hammer striking downward. The record was sealed immediately by the Ordo Hereticus, annotated only with the phrase, "imprint of betrayal." There were also unexplained atmospheric changes observed over the planet's surface. Periodic electromagnetic surges appeared at consistent intervals across centuries, recorded during unrelated Mechanicus surveys. These spikes always aligned with the anniversary of the massacre according to Terran calendar standards. The Ordo Malleus concluded that these were coincidental solar interactions, yet one inquisitor, named Edric Voss, proposed that the spikes were psychic pulse events, a recurring echo of the massacre imprinted into the warp itself, an emotional scar replaying its own trauma. Voss's report was dismissed as superstition, and he was reassigned to the Calixis sector, where he later vanished under unknown circumstances. Several sealed Inquisition reports from Millennia 32 also mention residual energy readings associated with nonlinear phase reflection. In lay terms, this meant that the surface occasionally emitted energy signatures identical to those found in orbit, as if the planet were briefly reflecting data from the void above it. This created a phenomenon akin to spatial mirroring, confusing scanners and corrupting cogitator readings. One theory proposed that the tremendous psychic and kinetic energy released during the battle created semi-permanent resonance pockets, subspace scars that occasionally intersect with the materium. The phenomenon remains unproven, though it bears disturbing similarity to effects observed on Prospero and Calth, both known sites of heavy psychic contamination. Among the most tightly classified records are the testimonies of the last human expeditions permitted to land on Isstvan V during the early 41st millennium. These included small Mechanicus survey teams accompanied by Inquisition observers. One such team reported uncovering an object partially buried beneath fused glass and ash, an Astartes helmet bearing no known Legion insignia, its surface composed of ceramite alloy unknown to Mechanicus databases. The material exhibited faint luminescence in total darkness and emitted a low-frequency hum perceptible only through Auspex. When the artifact was brought aboard the retrieval craft, it caused immediate system disruptions and forced the team to jettison it into orbit. The Inquisition sealed all related data, and the Mechanicus expedition commander was declared missing within months. Unverified data fragments, recovered from rogue archaeotechnologists and Heotechs, mention sightings of iron shadows on the planet's surface, autonomous constructs moving through the dust as if patrolling. These reports, while lacking any empirical verification, persist among the Ordo's classified rumour logs. One theory proposes that these entities could be malfunctioning automata, remnants of pre-heresy Mechanicus equipment still active underground. Another, less accepted hypothesis suggests they might be psychic projections of the Iron Hand's vengeance, materialised through the planet's empiric scar. The Ordo Malleus dismisses such notions as mythic residue, yet curiously, no further expeditions have been sanctioned to disprove it. Several patterns also link the Isstvan anomalies to later conflicts involving successor chapters of the betrayed legions. During the drop assault on Cretaceous, Salamander's gene-line warriors reported an unexplainable surge in battle fury and sensory overload during engagements in volcanic terrain, conditions similar to Isstvan's ash valleys. Later, during a battle on Medusa, Iron Hand's warriors claimed to hear vox fragments of long-dead commanders issuing orders from Isstvan itself. The transmissions were dismissed as interference, but timestamp analysis revealed identical frequency patterns to those used during the massacre. The recurrence of these patterns across millennia suggests that the data, or its echo, persists somewhere within the warp, repeatedly resurfacing during moments of significant psychic or emotional resonance. Within the Inquisition's sealed archives lies one final record, dated Millennia 40, year 921. It recounts the discovery of a transmission beacon buried deep within Isstvan's crust. The beacon emitted an automated distress call repeating in Low Gothic, "Ferrus stands." The signal was faint but continuous, its origin traced to the primary valley where the Primarch met his end. The Mechanicus attempted excavation, but withdrew after multiple equipment malfunctions and a minor seismic event that destroyed the landing zone. The Inquisition later ordered the beacon sealed and declared the site off limits under inquisitorial decree. Despite centuries of study, the anomalies tied to the Isstvan V Massacre remain unresolved. Some inquisitors assert they are simply the product of atmospheric radiation, corrupted data, or residual psychic energy. Others, more cautious, or perhaps more perceptive, suspect that the massacre marked a deeper rupture in the harmony of human destiny, an act so violently treacherous that it left behind a permanent echo in the weave of reality itself. The final compendium of inquisitorial files concerning the Isstvan V Dropsite Massacre remains one of the most heavily restricted archives in Imperial history. Buried beneath layers of encryption within the Tricorn Palace, these records are accessible only to Lord Inquisitors with dual Ordo sanction and Mechanicus validation codes. Most of what exists in public history, battle records, casualty counts, tactical breakdowns, represents only a fragment of the truth. The remainder has been deliberately buried under a veil of silence. This is not, as some may suspect, to conceal strategic information, but rather to contain the consequences of knowledge itself. The first classified dossier, known internally as Index Manus, focuses on the psychic and metaphysical repercussions of the massacre. Compiled by Ordo Malleus Savant Halbrecht Kael during the early 32nd millennium, it presents a grim hypothesis that the Isstvan betrayal created a psychic scar so deep it remains detectable across the warp even in the current age. Kael's report concludes that the scale of emotional betrayal, tens of thousands of genetically perfected warriors realizing in unison that they had been deceived by their brothers, produced a psychic shockwave measurable even by the standards of the Great Rift. The energy output recorded in the residual data of nearby systems, though centuries delayed, mirrors those found in worlds annihilated by demonic incursion. Kael postulated that the warp does not merely feed on death or emotion, but on the magnitude of betrayal itself. This idea, while speculative, gained enough traction to warrant suppression. The Ordo Hereticus feared it might inspire cults, or philosophical sects seeking to weaponize treachery as a means of metaphysical empowerment. The second sealed archive, Codex Isstvanus, compiled by the Ordo Hereticus in collaboration with the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, concerns the long-term psychic echoes recorded by sanctioned psychers who have attempted to commune near the Isstvan system. Many reported hearing overlapping voices, thousands whispering in fragmented binary and battle cant, repeating tactical orders that have not been used since the heresy. Others claim to witness flickering images of Astartes marching in perfect formation, vanishing upon approach. None of these psychers survived long after reporting their visions. Most succumbed to neural burnout or catatonic withdrawal. The Codex concludes with the recommendation that all further telepathic exploration of Isstvan V be prohibited indefinitely. The planet, it states, is no longer part of the living galaxy. it has become a reflection, a frozen memory within the warp. Another document, File Theta 9, pertains to a Mechanicus recovery team that returned from the planet carrying what appeared to be fragments of Ferrus Manus' armour. The fragments emitted faint electromagnetic fields despite the passage of thousands of years. When examined in controlled conditions aboard a Mechanicus orbital platform, the fragments began to pulse in synchronization with the heartbeat of the lead Magos overseeing the study. Moments later, the Magos suffered complete cardiac arrest, and the fragments ceased emitting energy. Subsequent attempts to replicate the conditions failed. The Mechanicus sealed the data, and the Ordo Hereticus appended a note suggesting that the remnants may have retained a psychic connection to their fallen bearer, a residual trace of the Primarchs' indomitable will. No further research was sanctioned. One of the few unredacted accounts within the archive comes from Inquisitor Van Delenor, who led a classified inspection of the planet's remains during the early 33rd millennium. Delenor described the surface as a cemetery of sound and silence, where Vox systems periodically activated on their own, replaying fragments of pre-battle transmissions. In his report, he states that the planet is haunted not by ghosts, but by the idea of betrayal given form. He noted that the ash planes still bear faint radiation signatures consistent with low-level empiric energy discharge, an impossibility without a warp breach. Delenor's expedition lasted only 9 days. Upon returning to orbit, he ordered the planet declared a sealed monument and requested immediate exterminatus authorization, not to destroy the world, but to erase its psychic echo entirely. The request was denied by the High Lords of Terror, citing preservation of historical significance. Another record, labelled Addendum Sigma 14, contains the transcription of a recovered Vox recording, intercepted by Ordo Hereticus agents during the late 39th millennium. The transmission originates from deep beneath the planetary crust and consists of 3 repeated phrases: "The iron does not forget," "The serpent still burns," and "The suns still wait." The Mechanicus determined that no active transmitter could exist at that depth, nor did any expedition ever deploy equipment there. The signal ceased abruptly after 7 minutes. Attempts to triangulate the source resulted in system malfunctions across the receiving station, forcing a full shutdown. The recording was sealed and classified under metaphysical interference. A final classified fragment, designated Data Spindle Row 9, consists of intercepted Ordo Xenos analysis that remains partly redacted. What survives of the text suggests the possibility that the surface materials of Isstvan V have undergone molecular restructuring not seen in any natural environment. Samples of rock and ash taken from the valley show traces of crystalline lattice formation, typically associated with worlds subjected to warp exposure, yet the isotopic alignment differs from any other known contaminated site. Some members of the Ordo Xenos have speculated that the massacre may have produced not just psychic residue, but actual physical mutation of the planet's crust, an alchemical transformation driven by the resonance of human emotion and betrayal. The Mechanicus vehemently rejected this claim, arguing that it bordered on heretical metaphysics. Still, the findings were never disproven, and the samples remain locked within the Calixian vaults under triple inquisitorial seal. From a broader perspective, the Inquisition views the Isstvan V Massacre not merely as the onset of the Horus Heresy, but as a singular point of fracture in the soul of mankind. It marked the moment when loyalty ceased to be absolute, when the concept of unity among the Emperor's sons dissolved into suspicion and fear. To the Ordo Hereticus, it is a case study in the corruption of belief, proof that faith, when weaponized by charisma and ambition, can destroy entire civilizations. To the Ordo Malleus, it remains an object lesson in the dangers of psychic resonance, an event that imprinted the warp itself with humanity's despair. To the Ordo Xenos, it stands as a demonstration that even human emotion can warp material reality. Each branch sees in it not just a tragedy, but a mirror, reflecting their own doctrines and fears. Modern inquisitorial analysis refers to this phenomenon as the Isstvan pattern, a convergence of mass loyalty, betrayal, and psychic trauma, resulting in temporal or metaphysical distortion. While no two events are identical, echoes of the pattern appear in later cataclysms. The burning of Prospero, the fall of Cadia, even isolated conflicts across the Great Rift. Wherever trust collapses and betrayal flourishes, minor fluctuations in reality seem to follow, whether coincidence or cosmic law remains unknown. In conclusion, the Inquisition's collective assessment of the Isstvan V Massacre is that it represents more than a military or political turning point. It is an ontological wound. A moment where faith, honour, and matter itself fractured simultaneously. The event demonstrated that mankind's greatest threat does not come solely from the warp or Xenos species, but from the instability within its own soul. Every empire built upon faith carries the potential for its own annihilation when belief becomes a weapon. Thus, the Inquisition's final position remains unchanged across millennia. Isstvan V is to remain untouched, uncolonized, and unremembered beyond the archives. Pilgrimages are forbidden. Excavations are punishable by death. The valley where Ferrus Manus fell is to be regarded not as a tomb, but as a scar, one that can never be healed, only studied from afar. For to gaze too long upon the memory of betrayal is to risk inviting it once more into the hearts of men,